Chapter 5. Arriving at the Anglista home that evening was the last thing that Bardurant wanted to do that evening. He and his mate Ren Vitan were supposed to go out on a date tonight with someone that she had met at the office where she worked as a receptionist. Ren Vitan said that Vin Lunar was attractive, witty, smart, and yet very humble in the way she carried herself. Sounded like a nice person that may become someone with which they could build a relationship. Bardurant and Ren Vitan had themselves been together for about 3 years now, after falling madly in love while on vacation. As was the case with young couples, they were more interested in each other than much of anything else. But, as is also the case with young couples, the more time that went by, the more they thought about starting a family. And that meant that it was time to start looking for a Vin gender to add to their union and make them a complete family. Tonight may have been the night to meet that special one, but much to the chagrin of his Wren mate, Bardurant had been told in no uncertain terms by his Traxian Armed Forces superior officer that his attendance at the meeting tonight was required. It wasn't often when this type of order for off-time activities came in, and so he knew better than to buck against it. With his dress cap smartly tucked under his left elbow, he knocked on the front door to the home of General Anglista. He was immediately greeted with the general's 13-year-old daughter, who was immediately taken with, and somewhat tongue-tied, by the neatly dressed officer in front of her. "Hi," was all she could immediately muster. "Good evening, miss. I'm here to speak to General Anglista," replied Major Machina. "Okay. Would you like to come in?" asked the young girl as she moved to the side. "Yes, miss, thank you." Bardurant walked in and waited for the young lady to close the door. "If you wait here, I'll let him know you are here. Whom I say is calling?" "Major Machina." "Okay, I'll be right back." "Thank you, miss." His perfect manners did little to assuage the ardor of the teenager, and as she walked away, she noted how good he smelled, and how flush she felt, meeting such a nice specimen. Getting to the parlor, she lightly knocked on the door where her father was meeting with a few others that were also dressed in their parade best. The door was opened by the one that happened to be standing nearest the door. She looked in to see all the military men and women that had been invited there tonight, and that they were gathered in a circle around her father. "Yes?" asked her father, who in this setting seemed to be all business. "There's a Major Machina here to see you, father." Looking at his watch, he said, "Ah, yes, right on time. Show him in, please, Diane." For a moment, Diane thought about how she hated her father calling her by her prepubescent name. She would have rather him call her by her gender name, Ren Diane. But that didn't normally happen until your 16th birthday. "God, that day is never going to come," thought Diane, as she walked back to the foyer. "If you'll follow me, he's expecting you," she elegantly said to the major while mustering her best smile. Majorly hot, she thought to herself, and secretly smiled. Entering the den where the others were congregated, the new arrival snapped to attention and quickly said, "Major Machina, reporting as ordered, General." "At ease, Major. These are some others that I've invited here to talk about something of great importance this evening. Everybody, please introduce yourselves to the Major." One by one, each in the group of about 15 introduced themselves to the Major. Seeing that the door to the den had been closed by his daughter, thus ensuring privacy, and knowing that there was a white noisemaker outside the door guaranteeing no eavesdropping, the general began to speak. "Before we get started here tonight, for the duration of this meeting, I grant all present permission to speak freely. Understood?" All in the room nodded and responded with a muffled "understood." The general then continued while scanning his eyes around the room.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've asked you here tonight to speak about something that is of great importance to our country. As you know, our country has been undergoing a period of upheaval lately, due in no small part to the economic situation that we find ourselves in. As more and more time goes by, it has become obvious to me that unless something is done to remedy the situation, this situation will eventually become a clear and present danger to the sovereignty of our country and all that we hold dear.
"Tell me about it," injected one of the sergeants assembled in the room. "Just yesterday, my Vin was telling me how there were several outages at the food market where she went shopping yesterday. They were supposed to get a shipment that afternoon, and in fact, when she went back later in the day, she was able to get what she needed, but that was the first time that type of thing had happened to her." "Same here," said another in the room. "It's starting to get like a gamble as to whether we are going to be able to find what we need just to put food on the table."
"See, that is what I'm talking about," responded the general. "I have been watching this situation progress, if that's what you want to call it."
The general rolled his eyes.
"For the last 40 years that I have been in the armed forces, and I haven't seen anything to indicate that it is going to get any better by itself."
This line of conversation wasn't anything new to the major. To the contrary, the major had lately been spewing very similar rhetoric to several of his compatriots about the heavy tariffs that are being charged by their neighboring nation, the United Nation of Aegon. That, coupled with the higher-than-normal prices that are being charged for UNA exports, represents an extraordinarily heavy hand on the necks of this country, the Democratic Republic of Traxus, or DRT for short. Major Machina thought about how the geography of their country was such that their eastern border was adjacent to another nation that the DRT seldom interacted with. Most of that was because the land of that eastern nation that bordered the DRT was nothing but desert, and crossing it was impossible on foot and was dangerous at best with a vehicle. If you had to get to the capital of that nation, certainly the best way would be by airplane, but there wasn't any real reason to go there. They seemed self-sufficient since their eastern border was the ocean, and they seemed to derive most of their in-country economy from it. The western edge of the landlocked DRT, where this meeting was being held, bordered the UNA, and as such was their only trading partner. The major had voiced his opinion to several of his acquaintances about how the UNA knew that they had the DRT at a great disadvantage, and that they were quite happy with it never changing. The DRT, where Major Machina called home, had unsuccessfully tried for decades to negotiate a trade agreement with the UNA that would result in better trade circumstances. But they just wouldn't agree to anything that would result in better conditions for the DRT. The borders, such as they are, were the result of the Treaty of Verdun that had been agreed to about 70 years prior, right about the same time that the Galimarians landed that first probe on Traxus and had made first contact. While at the time it seemed like a good idea to agree to the tenets of the treaty, it now seemed like a bad decision to all in the DRT. At the time, the Galimarians made it clear that they wouldn't open up diplomatic relations with the planet of Traxus unless there was a single planetary body they could deal with. They also made it known that any technology they shared with the people of Traxus were to be equally shared amongst all nations. Unknown to the major, it was him voicing those opinions that caused him to be invited to this meeting tonight. One of the others in the room spoke up and said in a very exasperated tone, "It would probably be better if we had access to the oceans and were able to do a little overseas trading. As it is, if we want to trade with them, we have to use these stupid airplanes. And that is only when the UNA says we can fly over their borders." Whilst the major smirked, General Inglesa on the other hand, replied,
"That basically sums up the whole reason why we are here. Unless something is done, we will suffer the consequences."
Major Machinist spoke up. "I see your point, General. And in fact, I've been talking about much the same thing to my acquaintances lately. But frankly, unless we decide to declare war against the UNA, I don't see any way of it ever changing."
"Exactly,"
came the short and very mysterious reply from the General. One of the VIN officers in the room furrowed her brow and said, "What exactly are you suggesting, General?" The General uncrossed his legs and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. His stance was that of sharing a secret, and so, imperceptibly, the group each seemed to lean forward themselves.
"What I'm saying is that we need to do something that will force the hand of those in the UNA, and even some of those in the DRT, to make some changes so that our country doesn't die."
After a few moments, the quiet in the room was pierced by a very important question. Major Machinist simply said, "Like?" Even though the General had completely thought through what his response would be at this moment, he dipped his head as if to present a person that was in quiet contemplation, and responding at the spur of the moment.
"I think I have a way to create a situation that will cause the UNA to come to us with their hats in their hands. I won't sugarcoat this, though. It might cause a few casualties. However, if we do it right, it doesn't have to cause any."
The General knew full well that it actually would cause casualties to some of the citizens of the UNA. But he also knew that this situation wouldn't have come to this point if the UNA had been fair in their dealings with the DRT, his beloved country. It was their own fault it had come to this.
"As I said earlier, you have the ability to speak freely at this meeting. I will add that if you don't feel you have the stomach to be part of this type of operation, you may leave now, and I will not count it against you in any way. In addition to that, if any do leave, I order the remaining ones here not to count it against them either."
The General then waited. He knew that using the wording about having the stomach for this operation would cause these battle-hardened officers to stay put. But he also had to cover his backside in the off chance that some wouldn't stay. All did. After the commensurate pause to allow for dissension, one of the group then said, "General, I think we're all staying. We all have families that we're concerned about, and we wish to give them a future." All officers in the room silently nodded their heads while simultaneously keeping their eyes fixed on their superior officer. Seeing that his officers were all in agreement, the General began to outline his plan.
"Okay. Now that I see that you are all in agreement with how grave our situation is, and how grave steps need to be taken, I will now outline to you a battle plan that has been in formulation for a while now. One of our science teams has been working with some of the technology that came from the Galimarians after they opened diplomatic relations with our planet 70 years ago. This team has figured out that if we use the Galimarian power generation abilities in a slightly different way than it was originally meant to have been used, we can cause a localized environmental condition that will cause the land where it is unleashed to be uninhabitable. I have been assured by our scientists that the effect will be localized to the exact areas where it is released, and the effect will dissipate within 1 day.
In reality, these very scientists were split down the middle as to whether the reactions would be so localized, and whether the effects of the proposed device would stop so quickly. Some of them wanted a substantially larger amount of study to be done in order to make sure the outcome wouldn't cascade into a runaway chain reaction. The elements found in the soil of Traxus were fundamentally different than the same found in the soil of Galimar, and so they strenuously argued for additional testing on Traxian soil. They tried, and eventually failed, to convince the general. They even resorted to telling him that, if the chain of reactions couldn't be arrested, it could actually cause the atmosphere to become unbreathable to every man, woman, and child. It wouldn't be poisonous, but the atmosphere would be completely converted to nitrogen, leaving absolutely no oxygen for the Traxians to breathe. How does it work?
Well, remember the N-ion bomb we developed recently?
Asked the general.
It operates on the same principle.
That is the anti-personnel device that leaves the buildings intact but renders the area unlivable. It would do the same thing? Asked Major Machina.
Almost. It actually can cause some structural damage, but we are accounting for that to minimize collateral damage,
came the short reply from the general. Again, he was stretching the truth, and he knew it. A few seconds went by as the personnel in the room thought about the plan and its implications. All in the room knew full well that casualties would be difficult to avoid with this type of weapon. But at the same time, all in the room arrived at the same conclusion the general had come to weeks before. Their backs had been put in the corner. They had no other option than to come out swinging. "Deployment?" came the one-word question from another in the room.
"Deployment would obviously be done covertly,"
answered the general.
"We can deploy and conceal the devices in remote caves and underground locations. They can be remotely triggered after our operatives have been extracted."
"And what would be our position once the natural disaster," the one asking used air quotes, "happens? How would this give us an advantage?"
Well, in preparation for this, I've been stockpiling NOx converters from Galimar as well. We have reverse engineered them, though, so that they end up having a shelf life. Unlike the ones we got from Galimar, these devices won't work permanently, and the UNA will require repeated shipments from us,
answered the general. "But they would just reverse engineer it themselves," retorted a sergeant in the corner. "They wouldn't need us to supply them."
"That's right, they would,"
replied the general,
"if it wasn't for the fact that opening the case would cause the mechanism to destroy itself beyond recognition."
The implication was clear. It would explode and cause serious injury and even death to any that tried. "Doesn't the UNA have their own NOx converters from Galimar?" asked someone standing next to the major.
"Our intelligence has determined that while there is one or two of the devices in the country, the UNA government hasn't deemed its use or reproduction to be a priority. The ones they do have in storage have been secretly sabotaged."
The general gave those in the room time to digest what had just been outlined. The plan was unpalatable for sure, but as the general pointed out, there didn't seem to be any option left. They were left with no choices. Something had to be done. There was no way they could go on. Major Machina stepped forward and picked up an as-yet unclaimed glass of water. Holding it out in front of him, he said, "May we have the strength to make the hard decisions for the good of our country, the Democratic Republic of Traxus." All around the room raised their glasses and toasted this despicable yet necessary plan. Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.